Somerville wasn't much to look at. A cluster of snow-covered houses, a gas station, and a general store. Winters were brutal here, and the nights stretched on forever. I was 16 that year, just old enough to feel too old for Christmas magic, but still young enough to miss believing in it. The town had its traditions. Every December, a man dressed as Santa Claus would visit neighborhoods, spreading holiday cheer. He'd leave candy canes on porches and knock on doors, asking kids if they'd been good. Harmless fun. But that year, something was different. It started with the flyers. They showed up in mailboxes after Thanksgiving. Santa Claus is coming to town. December 23rd to 25th, watch for him. The Santa in the picture wasn't the usual jolly caricature. His face was partially shadowed, and his smile was a little too wide, a little too sharp. I chalked it up to bad design. On the night of December 24th, my parents had gone to bed early after a long day of last-minute holiday errands. My younger brother, Ben, was in his room, likely trying to stay awake for Santa. The house was quiet except for the occasional groan of the furnace. Around 11:30, I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't the soft, polite knock of a neighbor or a friend. It was slow, deliberate, 3 heavy knocks that seemed to linger in the air. I froze, my book slipping from my hands. Who could be visiting at this hour? I crept to the living room, peeking through the blinds. Snow fell in thick sheets, obscuring the figure standing on our porch. But I could make out the red suit, the white trim. Santa Claus. My stomach tightened. This was supposed to be fun, right? Some neighbor in costume? But why was he here so late? And why did I feel wrong? He knocked again. Hello? I called through the door, my voice trembling. A moment passed before he replied. His voice was low, almost gravelly. Ho ho ho. Merry Christmas. Is Ben home? My blood ran cold. How did he know my brother's name? I didn't answer. Instead, I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The man outside chuckled softly. It wasn't a jolly sound, it was guttural, predatory. I have something for him, he said, his voice pressing against the walls of the house like a physical weight. The doorknob rattled. I bolted upstairs, locking myself in Ben's room. He was sitting on his bed, wide-eyed. Is it Santa? He whispered, his excitement mingled with fear. I don't think so, I muttered, pulling him close. From the window, I could see the porch. The man hadn't left. He stood perfectly still, staring at the door. His face was hidden under the brim of his hat, but I could feel his eyes, sharp and unblinking. And then he turned, looking straight up at us. I pulled the curtains shut, my breath hitching. We need to call Dad, I whispered, but when I reached for the phone, the line was dead. A scraping noise echoed from downstairs, the sound of metal against wood. I realized he was trying to pick the lock. I grabbed Ben's hand and whispered, We're going to the attic. Stay quiet, no matter what. The attic ladder creaked as we climbed. I shut the hatch behind us, praying he hadn't heard. In the dim light, surrounded by dusty boxes of ornaments and old furniture, we huddled together, listening. The door creaked open below. Ho ho ho, he called out, his voice echoing through the house. Where are my little helpers? His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if he wanted us to hear every step. Do you think he's the real Santa? Ben whispered, tears streaming down his face. No, I whispered back. He's not real, but the words felt hollow. The footsteps stopped directly below us. And then, a sound that made my skin crawl. The rickety ladder to the attic unfolding. I grabbed an old wooden bat from a corner of the attic, positioning myself between the hatch and Ben. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The hatch creaked open, and a red-gloved hand appeared, gripping the edge. Slowly, he pulled himself up. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were sunken pits of darkness. The fake beard hung in patches, revealing a twisted grin. He smelled like rotting meat and old snow. Found you, he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. I swung the bat with everything I had. It connected with a sickening crack, and he tumbled back through the hatch, landing with a heavy thud below. I didn't wait to see if he was getting up. I yanked Ben down the other side of the attic stairs and out the back door into the snow. We ran to our neighbor's house, pounding on their door until they let us in. The police arrived within minutes, but when they searched our house, they found no sign of him. The lock on the front door was intact, and the only footprints in the snow were ours. But in the middle of the living room, they found a single candy cane, striped red and white. The red wasn't dye. Was the kind of town that didn't make the news, a forgotten speck in the vastness of rural Ohio, where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed to change. Christmas here was a quiet affair, simple lights on porches, snow-covered lawns, and a town square dressed up with a modest tree. That year, I was 10, and my parents had decided to take me and my younger sister, Emma, to the town's annual Pictures with Santa event. The tradition was nothing fancy, just a makeshift grotto set up in the community center. But it was a big deal for kids, a chance to tell Santa your wishes and take home a Polaroid to pin on the fridge. When we arrived, the line snaked around the room. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and carols played softly through a crackling speaker. I remember being impatient, shifting from foot to foot, while Emma tugged at my sleeve, asking what I thought Santa would bring her. Finally, it was our turn. Santa sat in a worn red chair, his suit slightly too big, the beard askew on one side. He wasn't the cheerful, plump Santa you'd expect. This man was thin, his eyes sunken and surrounded by dark circles, as though he hadn't slept in weeks. His gloved hands twitched slightly as he gestured for us to come closer. "Ho ho ho," he said, his voice raspy, almost robotic. Something about him made my stomach churn, but I couldn't place why. Emma, oblivious, skipped up to him and climbed onto his lap. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Emma," she said proudly. He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "And what do you want for Christmas, Emma?" "A dollhouse," she exclaimed. He nodded, his hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder. "Of course." "And you," he said, looking directly at me, "why don't you join us?" I hesitated, but my mom nudged me forward. Reluctantly, I stood beside him, forcing a smile for the camera. The flash went off and the photographer handed us the Polaroid. The picture developed quickly, and my mom cooed over it. But when I looked at it, something felt off. The Santa in the photo wasn't smiling. His face was blank, his eyes staring straight into the camera as if he knew something we didn't. "Mom," I whispered, "can we go home now?" She waved me off, telling me to stop being dramatic. That night, as the snow fell thick and heavy outside, I couldn't shake the image of his face. Emma, on the other hand, was thrilled. She kept the Polaroid clutched in her hand, showing it to me every few minutes and talking about how Santa was going to bring her the best dollhouse ever. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was the branches of the oak tree outside my window, but then I heard it again, distinct, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the living room. I tiptoed down the hallway, careful not to wake my parents. The Christmas tree cast a soft glow over the room, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then I saw it, the Polaroid, sitting in the middle of the coffee table. I was certain Emma had taken it to bed with her. As I moved closer, my breath caught in my throat. The photo had changed. Emma was no longer sitting on Santa's lap. She was alone in the picture, her face twisted in an expression of terror. Behind her, the shadowy outline of a man loomed, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I stumbled backward, knocking into a chair. The noise echoed through the house, and suddenly, the tapping started again. This time, louder and more insistent. It was coming from the front door. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Slowly, the doorknob began to turn. "Ho ho ho!" A deep voice rumbled from the other side. I bolted up the stairs, slamming Emma's door open. She was sitting on her bed, staring at the window. Her small hands clutched the edge of the curtains. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who's here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She didn't reply. Instead, she pulled the curtain aside, revealing the driveway. Standing in the snow, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlight, was Santa. He was looking up at us, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. He raised a gloved hand and waved slowly, deliberately. I grabbed Emma's hand and dragged her out of the room, yelling for my parents. My dad stumbled out of their bedroom, half asleep, demanding to know what was going on. By the time we reached the front door, the man was gone. The next morning, my parents brushed it off as a bad dream. But when we checked the Polaroid again, Emma was missing from it entirely. We never saw her again. The police searched for weeks, combing through every inch of the town and the surrounding woods. They found nothing. The only clue was a single red glove, frozen in the snow beneath her bedroom window. That Christmas, and every Christmas since, I've dreaded the sound of tapping on the door, because deep down I know he'll come back, and next time he won't leave empty-handed. Silver Pines was the epitome of a small Midwestern town. In winter, the streets were lined with glowing wreaths, and every porch had its obligatory string of twinkling lights. It felt like a snow globe, serene, picturesque, perfect. I was 13 that year, old enough to help with the decorations but young enough to still feel the flicker of Christmas magic. My mom worked nights at the diner, and my dad had left years ago, so it was mostly just me and my little sister, Lily. At 8, she was still in the phase of writing long, elaborate letters to Santa and leaving out cookies and milk. It was December 21st, a Friday night, and a thick blizzard had rolled in. The streets were empty except for the occasional plow, and the wind howled like a living thing outside. Lily and I had spent the evening watching Christmas movies until she fell asleep on the couch. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of sleigh bells. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again, soft, distant, yet unmistakable. The gentle jingle grew louder, weaving through the whistling wind. Curious, I crept to the window. The snow was falling heavily, but through the haze, I saw something strange. A figure in red walking down our street, dragging something behind him. My heart skipped. He was wearing a Santa suit, complete with a hat and black boots. But something was off. His movements were slow, lumbering, like he was struggling under the weight of whatever he was pulling. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. A sack? No, it was too large, too human-shaped. I stepped back from the window, my breath fogging up the glass. That's when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. Lily stirred on the couch, rubbing her eyes. "Is it Santa?" she mumbled, half asleep. "Stay here," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. The knock came again, harder this time. I moved slowly to the door, peering through the peephole. He was standing there, his face obscured by the shadow of the porch light. But his posture was unnerving, too rigid, like a mannequin propped up in place. He wasn't holding a bag of toys. His hands were empty, hanging limp at his sides. "Hello," I called through the door, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. I turned to grab the phone, but the line was dead, a casualty of the storm. When I looked back through the peephole, he was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A moment later, I heard the back door rattle. I sprinted to the kitchen, flipping on the light. The door's flimsy lock was straining under the force of someone twisting the knob. I grabbed a knife from the counter, my hands shaking. "Go away," I shouted. The rattling stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, a deep, raspy voice. "Have you been good this year?" My blood turned to ice. I ran back to the living room, pulling Lily off the couch. "We need to hide," I whispered, dragging her toward the staircase. She didn't understand, tears welling in her eyes. "But Santa, that's not Santa," I hissed, my voice harsher than I intended. We climbed into the attic, pulling the hatch closed behind us. The wind outside had grown fiercer, and the house creaked under its weight. For a while, all we could hear was the storm. But then the bells returned. They were closer this time, accompanied by slow, deliberate footsteps. Ho ho ho! The voice echoed from somewhere below us. Lily whimpered, burying her face in my shoulder. I held her tightly, trying to stay silent. The footsteps grew louder, ascending the stairs. Do you know what I do to naughty children? The voice crooned. I bit down on my lip, willing myself not to scream. The attic hatch rattled. Come out, come out. Wherever you are, he sang, his tone playful yet dripping with malice. I clutched the knife tighter, my knuckles white. Lily's small body trembled against mine. The hatch creaked open, revealing his face. It wasn't a mask. It was a man's face, pale and stretched taut, like the skin was barely clinging to his skull. His eyes were glassy and wide, and his smile was impossibly large, revealing rows of yellowed teeth. Found you, he whispered. I lunged at him with the knife, slashing wildly. He recoiled, his grin faltering for the first time. I didn't stop, pushing him back down the ladder. He fell with a sickening thud, and the house fell silent. I didn't dare leave the attic until morning. When we finally emerged, the house was empty, the doors still locked from the inside. But in the snow outside, there were footprints. Deep, heavy prints leading away from the house, dragging something behind them. At the end of the trail, they stopped abruptly, as if he'd vanished into thin air.